Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. 5 seconds. That's all it takes to fix the picture in your head. A ground floor village house in Lung Mei, Taipo, a power outlet working, a refrigerator humming, and a search team stepping in on February 24th, 2023. This is not drama, it's procedure. Entry was lawful and documented. The team established a clean perimeter, logged personnel, and divided the interior into zones. Temperature readings were taken immediately. What they encountered indicated human remains under refrigeration and containers consistent with heat exposure. Nearby, investigators noted plastic sheeting and powered cutting equipment. Each item was photographed in situ, tagged, and bagged. Chain of custody started at the threshold and did not break. No speculation was recorded in the first pass, only measurements, condition notes, and placement. From the start, officers treated this as the primary processed scene. That designation matters. It prevents narrative drift and preserves the integrity of what follows. The focus here was simple: identify what exists, identify what is absent, and protect the evidence from contamination. Swabs were collected from contact surfaces. Drain and trap components were removed for laboratory screening. Packaging was inspected for trace, fibers, hair, tissue, microparticulates, anything that could speak later when machines and analysts have their turn. There's a human cost behind every checklist. Abby Choi, 28, model and public figure, had been reported missing 3 days earlier. But inside this address, the tone stayed clinical. Document, preserve, move forward. The team logged items attributable to Abby, personal effects that anchored the scene to a name without editorializing on cause or sequence. If you've watched Dateline or 48 Hours, you've seen this rhythm. Hard stops, careful restarts, no assumptions that outrun the notebook. One point of control kept repeating on every page. The 7-seater vehicle connected to Abby's last known movements would be processed as a secondary mobile scene, not a new address, not a second main scene. That distinction prevents exactly the kind of confusion viewers call out when stories wander. Routes will come later. For now, the house stands on its own. What didn't appear was just as telling. No signs consistent with accident, no environmental markers suggesting a medical collapse. The absence list doesn't prove a case, but it narrows the lanes. As one senior investigator put it, the data align too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. In Hong Kong, a city built on precision, this address read like preparation, not chance. If you're watching with a forensic eye, a single question begins to drive everything. How long had this been in motion? We'll answer that by stepping backward to the moment Abby failed to arrive for a routine pickup. Then forward through cameras, license plate readers, and handset activity. We won't guess. We'll follow what was found, what was recorded, and what was charged. And we'll keep the legal posture where it belongs. In court, February 21st, 2023 began as a routine school day on Abby Choi's calendar. The expectation was simple: a pickup window, a short ride, and a return to regular obligations. When that window closed without contact, the response was not panic, it was procedure. Officers opened a missing person file, locked the relevant time band, and moved to reconstruct the last verified movements, minute by minute. The first anchor was transportation. Building staff confirmed Abby stepped into a 7-seater assigned to her use. That vehicle became the axis for the initial timeline. Investigators pulled plate recognition hits along arterial roads, indexing timestamps against toll cameras and neighborhood surveillance near residential and commercial nodes. The car appears in sequence across Hong Kong Island and Kowloon corridors before route fragments point toward the new territories. None of those sightings by themselves prove intent. They give the case geography and a clock. Telecom data narrowed the field. Analysts obtained subscriber records and tower interactions under lawful authority. A handset associated with Abby registered expected activity early in the day, then a reduction that tracked with travel segments. There is value in silence when it follows movement. It defines gaps to test. Investigators marked each gap, then canvassed for cameras positioned to fill it. Housing estates, service stations, and junctions where local councils maintain coverage. Where cameras were absent, license plate readers filled part of the lane. Where readers were absent, baseline travel time and ordinary congestion stood in as a control. The goal was not to dramatize. It was to find anomalies that justify escalation. Household obligations created the trigger. When a parent can't be reached and a scheduled pickup fails without explanation, the missing person classification shifts from low risk to elevated. Officers notified specialized units, preserved the window between the last normal interaction and the first missed commitment, and expanded the canvas to include service providers and recent contacts. Interview questions were limited to logistics, appointments, drivers, errands, meetings. The tone stayed clinical. No one speculated on motive. No one assigned blame. As the map hardened, a line of travel toward Tai Po became more probable than any alternative. That conclusion did not come from a single camera angle. It came from parallel logs, license plate readers that saw the seven-seater entering a corridor that feeds the district, a handset that stopped communicating in a pattern consistent with that route, and a lack of credible pings elsewhere. An investigator summarized it this way: the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that is the problem. Clean lines can be engineering, not accident. What happens next in a case like this follows an established playbook. You preserve data upstream of the probable destination so it can be compared against what you find if a scene is located. You flag the vehicle for forensic processing as a mobile scene. You request retention on surrounding cameras in case a late lead requires a backward look. And you begin drafting the requests you will need if the matter escalates beyond a missing person. Equipment warrants, location records, and access to any leased properties tied to subjects of interest should those appear. By the end of the first 48 hours, the case was not a story. It was a stack of records with a direction. The last known ride tied to Abby, the corridor that points north, and the unbroken chain of normal obligations that went unmet. No 911 call defined the start. This is Hong Kong, and the escalation came from absence, not alarm. Families and friends often want answers fast. The job is to build answers that survive court. There is a human reality beneath the paperwork. Abby Choi was 28, a public figure, and a parent. The tone here stays steady because precision is the only way to serve her and the system that will judge what happened. In towns like Duluth, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. In Hong Kong, density doesn't blunt that truth. It amplifies it. When a routine pickup fails and a handset goes quiet, a city that runs on schedules notices. This phase ended when evidence at a village address in Tai Po met the trajectory suggested by the maps and the logs. The handoff from missing person protocol to a homicide investigation did not happen because someone guessed. It happened because the route, the silence, and the absence of any credible alternative aligned with a single destination already under scrutiny. Public cases move faster when the people at the center are easy to define. Abby Choi was 28. A working model and influencer in Hong Kong, raising 4 children while balancing brand work, travel, and family logistics. Colleagues described her schedule as structured. Handlers, drivers, fixed windows for shoots and pickups. That structure is why a missed obligation on February 21, 2023, registered as abnormal. The investigation stayed inside that frame. Who managed transportation? Who handled property? Who relied on her income? And what legal ties bound those relationships? Detectives began with role maps, not theories. They identified prior marital ties and current domestic arrangements, then overlaid them with duties Abby paid for: a driver on call, routine home movements, and custody-related exchanges. The original mandate here is simple: who had proximity to her movements and to her finances. Interviews stayed in the lane of logistics, where people were supposed to be: who had keys, who signed for packages, who scheduled the car. Every claim was requested with a document or a timestamp. Property was not background. It was a measurable system. Records were pulled for high-value real estate associated with the extended family, including the property known publicly as part of the Kaduri Hill portfolio. Investigators requested title documents, mortgage or tenancy agreements, and any recorded transfers. The purpose was not to declare motive. It was to see whether paper movement preceded or followed behavioral movement. If a lease was executed in early February, that date matters. If payments shifted beneficiaries around the same period, those dates matter. A clean case builds when calendars match, contracts here, travel there. Financial analysts traced recurring obligations Abby covered for others: housing allowances, driver compensation, household costs that indicate reliance. They compared bank activity with messaging patterns where lawful access existed. Any unusual cash withdrawals or consolidations in the weeks before February 21st were marked for later explanation. Luxury assets were inventoried where they could be authenticated. Watches, designer items, goods with serial numbers that make them traceable. The exercise was clinical: what was owned, who possessed it, and what insurance riders existed. When police look at families in stressed financial situations, they avoid labels and count dependencies. Who lost a benefit if Abby changed a title? Who lost income if she adjusted a contract? Those answers don't prove violence, but they help explain pressure. The team did not attribute intent to anyone at this stage. They documented conditions, agreements, renewals, the presence of counsel, and any notices of dispute. In a city where paperwork rules, this is where risk lives or dies. Digital forensics supported the paper. Devices linked to family members, again under lawful process, were scoped for calendar blocks, property viewings, and communications about leases or renovations. Even a single message about looking for space in a specific district can matter when it lands next to a rental date for a house in the same area. Investigators flagged early February activity that connected with Tai Po, then set it aside for the team handling scene processing to compare later. The case never left its lanes. The scene team handled Lung Mei, the document team handled titles and payments, the timeline team handled the seven-seater and cameras. There is a human side to this kind of record work. People build complicated arrangements when families reconfigure. Abby maintained support even after separation in ways that colleagues considered generous. The reporting on this case repeatedly noted her financial role in providing housing and employment to prior in-laws, including the continued use of a driver who was also a relative by marriage. None of that determines guilt. It does, however, describe a network tied to her decisions. When those decisions shift, sell this, retitle that, the change is not abstract. Someone's rent, job, or leverage is now different. The restraint here is important. Viewers may want conclusions. Investigators want consistency. So this chapter stops where the records stop. A high-value property environment, dependencies documented on paper, and a February calendar that includes a lease in the Tai Po area before Abby disappeared. That before is the only conclusion we accept right now. Before the missing person file opened, before the Lung Mei search, before the public learned the word refrigerator would be part of a homicide report. In investigative work, before is a warning light. It signals planning without telling you whose plan it was. You can hear the quiet thesis of the case taking shape. People tied to Abby by family, by contract, and by housing. Assets that don't move quietly. And a paper trail that prints dates clean enough to test against cameras and cars. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that is the problem. Clean lines can be engineered. That is why the unit that handles financial crime techniques often sits at the same table with homicide in complex domestic cases. They are reading the same calendar for different reasons. There is a civic lesson that doesn't require drama. When money, housing, and custody arrangements overlap, put every promise and every expectation on paper with counsel. It protects children, cools disputes, and gives investigators facts if something goes wrong. The goal isn't fear, it's clarity, before the crisis, not after. This story remains in Hong Kong. The people named later by prosecutors will be presented in their legal posture, charged, not convicted, in the homicide matter as of September 22, 2025. For now, the record shows Abby's public life ran on schedules. Her private obligations made other lives possible, and early February documents point north toward Tai Po. At the same moment, the timeline in Chapter 2 tilted in that direction. Movement came first, not motive. After the missing person report on February 21, 2023, investigators built a travel profile using sources that don't argue. Building confirmations, license plate recognition, municipal cameras, private CCTV from housing estates and shop fronts, and telecom tower interactions. The subject vehicle, a seven-seater known to be assigned to Abby Choi, was the anchor. Analysts established the last verified pickup, then segmented the city into corridors where that vehicle could realistically travel within each time band. The aim was narrow: reconstruct directionality, identify gaps, and decide where to put real resources. Plate readers supplied the earliest hard hits, time-stamped and geocoded. Those hits guided requests to adjacent camera networks. Where a municipal camera didn't cover an intersection, canvassers pulled from property managers and transport depots along the same lane. Each positive sighting generated a block, a small verified segment that could be chained to the next. The blocks trended out of Hong Kong Island and across Kowloon, then pointed toward the new territories. No single camera told the story, but the combined lattice did. Investigators tested the lattice by running control drives at similar hours to understand congestion artifacts and ordinary delays. If the seven-seater should have taken 17 minutes between 2 points and the record shows 29, the extra 12 must be explained: fuel, stop, handoff, or a camera blind zone. Telecom data supported the road picture. Under lawful process, the team retrieved tower associations for a handset linked to Abbey. The pattern showed expected interactions early, then a reduction that matched vehicle movement through known coverage shadows. Silence alone means little. Silence paired with consistent direction means the search can be focused without guesswork. Analysts overlaid the handset windows against the plate reader blocks and flagged 3 key gaps. Each gap became a target zone for rapid retrieval of private CCTV before retention cycles overrode it. In Hong Kong, the difference between a usable frame and nothing at all can be a store manager who saves a clip before midnight. The seven-seater needed to be found and forensically preserved without alerting anyone who might try to move or clean it. Detectives entered the plate into discrete alerts, then set a capture plan that prioritized control over speed. When the vehicle was located, the team would secure it as a mobile scene. Windows up, battery disconnected if necessary, exterior shielded from weather, and a tow to an indoor facility where trace can be protected. That plan sat ready while the map team kept pushing the corridor north. A second layer asked a different question. Where could a private address intersect with this route without drawing attention? Property investigators scanned recent leases and short-term rentals that aligned with early February paperwork. Tai Po surfaced as the most plausible search geography, not because of rumor, but because the blocks pointed there and documentation existed to justify interest. At this stage, the work remained procedural. Draft warrants were prepared in parallel with continued canvassing so there would be no delay if a specific address met threshold. By the end of day 2, the corridor was no longer an idea. It was a set of time-stamped squares on a city map, each tied to a plate read, a camera frame, or a retention notice. Where the lattice showed nothing, officers documented why. No camera installed, lens obstructed, retention expired, or angle insufficient to capture the lane in question. Those negatives would matter later when defense counsel asked how the team knew what it knew. You don't prove a route by asserting it. You prove it by listing every place you looked and what you found there, even if what you found was absence. When the address in Lung Mei, Tai Po entered the conversation, it did so inside this framework. A rental date in early February meant the location existed on paper before Abby failed to make a routine school pickup. A corridor trending toward Tai Po meant a search there was not a fishing expedition. The careful part is sequencing. The team didn't bend the route to fit the address. They checked whether the address lived on the route built from independent sources. It did. The human piece is simple. Families assume cities are watched, but coverage is uneven. The only way to restore a person's last hours with integrity is to collect what exists fast, mark what doesn't, and keep emotion out of the acquisition. In towns like Duluth, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. In Hong Kong, scale changes the logistics, not the principle. A city still expects proof it can audit. With the corridor defined and retention secured, command authorized the next step, move from a geographic theory to a physical search. The timing mattered. You want cameras locked, the vehicle ready for controlled seizure, and your paperwork clean. When the search team finally crossed the threshold at Lung Mei on February 24th, they walked into a scene that matched the route logic and the calendar logic discussed in earlier sections. Routes point to destinations. The house confirmed it. The Lung Mei address was processed as a crime scene, not a theory. Entry logs documented the time, personnel, and zones. The first priority was preservation, stabilize temperatures, shut down airflow that could move particulates, and begin a slow walkthrough with body-worn cameras running. Photography captured every surface before a single item moved. After that, technicians switched to close-range stills, scale rulers visible, and built a numbered grid so every exhibit could be reassembled on paper if needed. Cold storage came first. Containers and interior shelving were measured, swabbed, and photographed in place. Any item consistent with human tissue was double-bagged, sealed, and placed into a dedicated cooler with temperature data loggers. Chain of custody forms started at the point of recovery and followed each package. Nothing left the house without a signature and a timestamp. In parallel, a separate team collected control swabs from clean surfaces so the lab could differentiate background contamination from event-related biologicals. Cutting equipment was documented in situ, powered off, and treated as potential toolmark sources. Blades were removed by a technician in full PPE, then packaged in rigid containers to prevent new striations. Investigators photographed any residue lines, nick patterns, or metal transfer on housings. Later in the lab, those marks could be compared against kerf characteristics on recovered material to determine if a specific blade made a specific cut. Toolmark work is slow, it's also objective. The wet room and the kitchen received the most meticulous attention. Drain traps were disassembled into labeled components, each sealed separately. Floors and splash zones were screened using targeted presumptive tests, not broad sprays that generate false positives. Swabs went into sterile tubes with desiccant. Hair and fiber trace were lifted with gelatin lifters and stored on acetate sheets. The goal was to capture micro-evidence that could outlast any cleaning. Negative findings were documented with the same care as positives. There were no indicators consistent with a medical collapse at this address. No drug paraphernalia, no documents suggesting home care, no signs of a sudden attempt at cardiopulmonary resuscitation. That absence doesn't solve a case, but it narrows plausible explanations and helps an eventual jury weigh competing narratives. Personal effects linked to Abby Choi were logged early, items that tied the location to a named victim without speculation about sequence or cause. Identification in a case like this relies on laboratory confirmation, not familiarity, so any item with possible DNA or latent prints was packaged before being handled for visual inspection. When partial anatomical material is recovered, identification follows a defined ladder: DNA profiling against known standards, odontology if applicable, and when available, distinctive healed features. The lab will not guess, it will match. At the vehicle bay, a separate team prepared for the 7-seater's intake. While that mobile scene is covered later in detail, the interface matters here. Technicians synchronized sample numbering so cross-transfer questions could be answered cleanly. If fibers in the house matched fibers in the vehicle, the paperwork would show which sample was taken first and which glove sets were used for each step. That's how you answer contamination challenges before they're made. Back inside, packaging was a discovery vector of its own. Outer bags, liners, and ties were screened for prints and touch DNA. If an item carried residue consistent with cleaning agents, the lab noted brand markers or surfactant profiles that could be compared to containers recovered on site. Simple products, bleach, degreasers, can still speak through minor ingredient signatures and timing. A product fresh on one surface and degraded on another can imply sequence. The scene exit protocol mirrored the entry: final photographs, zone sign-offs, and an evidence reconciliation. Nothing is worse for a complex case than a paperwork gap you could have avoided. Before the last technician stepped out, supervisors confirmed that all containers were sealed, all coolers had active loggers, and all exhibits were listed on a master manifest matching the room grids. The house was then handed back to uniformed officers on guard until additional searches or court orders required re-entry. From a human standpoint, this is the chapter most people never see. It looks clinical, even cold, but the rigor exists for a reason. Families deserve conclusions that survive scrutiny. Communities deserve a process that doesn't guess its way to a headline. When investigators believe a location was prepared in advance, they don't say it. They show it with dates, invoices, leases, and here with traces that behave like preparation. Cutting tools with consistent wear, traps and surfaces with chemical patterns that don't match ordinary home use, packaging that explains transport and storage instead of accident. There was one more practical step: landfill coordination. When a case indicates partial recovery at a fixed address, municipal partners are notified to preserve relevant transfer station logs and to isolate loads from specific dates. That action doesn't declare what will be found. It ensures nothing is lost if leads develop. The public sometimes mistakes caution for certainty. It's not. It's a hedge against time. What matters for our continuity is simple. The Lung Mei house stands as the primary processed scene, fully documented. The evidence leaving that door did so with clean chain of custody and defined cold chain handling. That identification of recovered material would be laboratory-driven. The question that began this series, how long had this been in motion, now has a physical counterpart. How many surfaces, tools, and containers recorded the motion? Once the Lung Mei scene was secured and the route lattice held, command moved from evidence to custody. Operations were split. One team tracked persons of interest. Another prepared paperwork to convert an investigative picture into charges that could stand in court. The principle was speed without error. Detain, preserve rights, lock evidence. Between February 24th and 26, 2023, Hong Kong police executed coordinated arrests. Individuals with proximity to Abby Choi's movements and household logistics were taken into custody under lawful authority. Search and seizure orders were served in parallel to prevent data deletion and to freeze any location that might hold communications, devices, or financial records. A separate action targeted the seven-seater. The vehicle was intercepted, documented externally, wrapped for weather control, and towed under seal to an indoor bay to begin mobile scene processing. This sequencing avoided cleanup windows and gave prosecutors a straight chain from roadway to lab. At station, the custody posture followed standard safeguards: notification of rights, access to counsel, contemporaneous notes during any interview, and audio/video recording policies observed. Investigators focused on verifiable items only: appointments, keys, vehicle access, property visits, and who handled which bills. Any statement that touched the route or the typo geography was tested against records before it was written into a brief. The aim was to make the case out of timestamps, not recollections. Charging decisions landed quickly. Prosecutors filed murder counts against key arrestees tied to the timeline and the scene, and as filings evolved, preventing lawful burial or obstructing justice, where the facts supported those allegations. Court appearances were brief but important. Remand applications set the custody baseline, disclosure schedules started, preservation orders for third-party data, marinas, telecom, private CCTV, were extended to stop auto-deletion. Bail arguments focused on flight risk, the gravity of the offense, and the integrity of evidence still being processed. The court's rulings kept the defendants in custody while laboratory work and digital forensics advanced. Financial artifacts began to move from context to supporting material in the case file. Titles, leases, and payment records documented dependencies and timing, especially the early February rental relevant to Tai Po. Prosecutors framed these as alleged motive indicators, not conclusions. The homicide brief remained anchored in physical evidence, route reconstruction, and device behavior, with property documents corroborating a planning window. That posture matters for juries. Jurors trust calendars that match. You will hear more in a later section about separate obstruction proceedings involving a boat plan in 2025. Those are not the homicide case and do not decide it. Likewise, a 2024 sentence for unrelated theft jumping bail involving a named defendant sits outside the homicide file. Keeping these lanes separate avoids the two endings problem viewers hate. Here the result is narrow and exact: arrests, formal charges, and a court-managed path while the evidence matures. There's a human line to draw. Custody isn't victory, it's control. Families want resolution, but prosecutors need admissible proof, not emotion. In a high-profile case, discipline is the difference between a headline and a conviction. The legal language stays careful because it has to: alleged, charged, pending. That restraint honors the victim more than any flourish ever could. Property and cash flows don't prove homicide, but they define pressure and timing. Investigators pulled title histories, tenancy files, bank activity linked to recurring obligations, and insurance riders tied to high-value goods. They worked backward from February 2023 to see what moved before Abby Choi disappeared, and forward from the Lung Mei search to test whether the paper trail matched what was found on the ground. First, titles and leases. Records associated with the extended family showed a pattern of support Abby maintained, housing and employment arrangements that anchored others to her decisions. Early February paperwork reflected a rental linked to the Tai Po area. That entry mattered because it existed before the vehicle route tilted north on the 21st. Prosecutors later described these documents as indicators of planning. Detectives filed them as dates, parties, and amounts. Nothing more, nothing less. Second, payments. Analysts reviewed regular transfers Abby made to cover living costs and services, including a driver retainer. Where access was lawful, they compared that schedule to cash movements near February 21st, withdrawals, consolidations, or unusual spikes in liquidity. They cross-checked those entries against messages and calendar notes that reference viewing space or finding a place in the new territories. The methodology stayed disciplined. Every assertion needed a timestamp, a bill, or a ledger entry. Third, assets that travel. Luxury items, watches and designer goods with identifiable serials, were listed where provenance could be shown. When police intercepted a subject in late February with significant cash and high-value watches, those items were recorded, photographed, and traced against prior ownership. The purpose wasn't theater. It was to show who held what when, and whether any sudden liquidation tracked with the days surrounding Abby's disappearance. Everything went into a reconciliation table: lease dates against route blocks, recurring payments against phone silences, cash on hand against prior balances. Where something aligned, it was marked corroborative. Where it didn't, it was flagged for defense challenge later. The restraint mattered. Prosecutors would frame theory. The file itself had to read like a ledger. Clean lines can be engineered. That's precisely why you pair paper with movement and scene evidence before you speak in court. There's a human dimension here that doesn't require embellishment. When families split but support continues, expectations harden. If a title shifts or a residence must be sold, the impact is immediate for everyone tied to that roof or paycheck. The lesson isn't moral, it's practical. Agreements should be formal, counseled, and current. That protects people when financial weather changes. By the close of this phase, the money trail did what good trails do. It set a window. A rental before the disappearance, dependencies documented in the months prior, cash and goods accounted for at seizure. None of it claims a weapon or a moment. It narrows who had reason to control outcomes, and when the risk rose, parallel to the homicide file, investigators built a narrower case about an attempted escape by water. Under lawful process, they authenticated messages that discussed arranging a boat, short-notice departure windows, and pricing. The court treated it as conspiracy to pervert the course of public justice, agreement plus steps taken. In June 2025, 2 individuals were convicted and sentenced to 6 months. That proceeding stands alone. It does not decide who committed murder. A different, earlier lane is also separate from the killing. In June 2024, Alex Kwong received over 3 years for unrelated theft and jumping bail. Mentioning it here isn't stacking the deck, it's keeping the record straight so this story never feels like 2 endings. The homicide file rises or falls on its own evidence. Where then does the court case stand? As of September 22, 2025, the murder case remains pending in Hong Kong. Individuals charged in the homicide, Alex Kwong, Anthony Kwong, and Kwong Kao, face murder counts and, as filings evolved, preventing lawful burial allegations. Jenny Lee faces obstruction-related proceedings. They are presumed innocent unless and until a court rules otherwise. The path ahead is procedural. Disclosure, admissibility rulings, and the laboratory and timeline work you've seen across this series, now tested in court. Abby Choi's name deserves accuracy before emotion. This series stayed with a single spine: a missing person trigger, a defined travel corridor, a lawfully searched address in Tai Po, custody and charging decisions, and a financial paper trail that spoke to pressure and timing without declaring motive as fact. No shortcuts, no extra scenes, no second ending. A brief human note, because cases like this echo beyond headlines. When families and finances intersect across past and present relationships, formal agreements and clear boundaries are not cold, they are protective. They create records that de-escalate disputes and, when needed, help authorities find the truth without guesswork. Safety often starts with paperwork. What I take from Abby Choi's story is simple. Document the promises, set clear boundaries, and tell people where you're going before life gets loud. Safety isn't paranoia, it's preparation. What do you think matters most? A written agreement, a trusted contact, or a shared itinerary? Drop your thoughts and where you're watching from in the comments. If this episode moved you, or if it didn't, tell me why. And if you want more fact-first true crime, subscribe to Creepy Crime Story and stay with us for the next case.